Hi guys, I am the founder and director of Protect Our Baddies. I am also a survivor myself. I was kidnapped for the purpose of being sent to a foreign country for trafficking. As you guys can see, that plan was not fulfilled. I am now part of the 0.02% that escapes. Protect Our Baddies is originally an e-commerce shop where we sell self-defense weapons, but we wanted to branch out to YouTube to dedicate a channel to survivors and their stories. I believe that these stories will bring impact, awareness, unmasked deception, and hopefully inspire you guys. Our Protect Our Baddies shop is currently funding all of these projects. So if you haven't shopped with us, go check us out. We have tasers, self-defense keychains, knives, so much stuff, literally the cutest weapons ever. We are planning to go to new states, so just know that you are helping us fund these powerful projects and being part of the movement. Thank you guys. Enjoy the video.
Hi, I'm Marjorie Saylor, and today I'm going to share my story. So my sexual abuse started at the age of 5, but my story really starts before that. I grew up in a home of domestic violence, and my mom had married my stepfather when I was 2. My mom tells me, when she remembers back to that time, she tells me that I used to be a really laughing, bubbly baby girl until she married my stepfather. And then I became quiet. I didn't want to hug. And I remember through middle school even, I was very standoffish. I didn't want to be affectionate. It felt uncomfortable for me. But she was with him, I think, till I was right about 14. Like as early as I can remember, I remember being in church. And my mom was always the one to take me. My mom had a very strong belief system in her faith, and she really was instrumental in helping me understand, who God was. I have a very strong belief as well. And although the church that we grew up in was a very independent, fundamental Baptist upbringing. Actually, there's a documentary out on the church that I grew up in called Let Us Pray, P-R-E-Y, Let Us Pray. And it was a docuseries on the church denomination that I grew up in. And the second episode of that docuseries was really focused on the actual church that I attended. And so my mom started attending that church, and we grew up thinking that women only speak when they're spoken to. Our opinions didn't matter, right? And I saw my mom being abused by her husband, my stepfather. I saw the church not helping her with that, but almost normalizing it and actually putting blame on her. You need to be a better wife. You need to be a better spouse. And they didn't believe in divorce or separation, even if domestic violence was there. And so I think that really did play a role in making me vulnerable to exploitation to begin with. However, that also helped develop my relationship with God. So I remember even at the age of 5, when the sexual abuse started, I was just drawing so close to God. And I would have nightly dreams. I remember actually my first dream, I was walking down a path and it had a fork in the road. And I don't remember if I heard this story in Sunday school about the fork in the road, but one path led to heaven and the other path led to hell. And I was on the path that was going towards hell. And I knew that because the ground was getting hotter and hotter under my feet the farther I went, and I couldn't turn around. I just kept going down that path. And it scared me because I knew exactly where I was going. I was 5 years old, but I knew. And it scared me so much that I actually woke up out of my sleep. And I sat up in my bed and I just kept praying over and over and over. It was like, Jesus, come into my heart. Come into my heart. Come into my heart. And I prayed that over and over till I felt like Jesus was in my heart. And I don't know how I figured that out or knew that at the time, but I just, was finally able to feel peace. And then I laid back down and I went to sleep. And then after that, I kept having recurring dreams. And they were different each time, but it was the same. And Jesus or the Holy Spirit would come and take me by the hand, and we'd fly over rooftops. And he would point out people to me. This is why this person does this. This is why she's like that. And looking back now, I was learning about human character. I was learning about humanity. So here I am, 5 years old. I'm having these dreams, but also at the same time, I'm experiencing the domestic violence my mom is going through. I'm not validated as a person of value at home. I'm being told that I'm stupid. I'm being told that I won't amount to anything. You know, these words from my stepfather. I'm watching how abuse equals love, or at least that's, you know, how I received it. Even though I knew the love of God, I mean, I clearly knew something was wrong, but I was learning that's what men wanted. And then I was also being taught to be a submissive wife. When the sexual abuse started, then I started to realize what men wanted was what my body could do for them. And then going into relationships of my own, it was easy to just give myself away. I was being submissive. I was being obedient. I was showing them love because that's what I thought love was. And so that left me very vulnerable. Sexual abuse continued through the age of 14. And then finally, my mom nearly lost her life at the hands of my stepfather. And that finally motivated her to make a change and get us out of that situation. So we went to Orange County to move in with my grandparents. And I was sexually assaulted by a football player on our high school basketball team at the high school that I was in at the time. I was 15 at the time. That was, I think, a pivotal moment for me, because even with the sexual abuse and all the confusion around that, this was my virginity that was gone. This was the point where the enemy lied to me, and I believed that lie, and it was so detrimental for so long. After that happened, growing up in a church where your virginity is so important and you're saved that for your husband, and I wanted a husband so bad because that's what was instilled in me, to be a helping wife. And so that was my dream. I wanted that so much. And when I lost my virginity in that assault, I lost my value, or so I thought. And so it was really easy for me at that point to just give myself away. Not long after that, I ran away from home because things at home were still toxic. My mom missed my stepfather. And it was crazy to me that she missed him after all the things. And I'd tried to come clean about the sexual abuse, and I wasn't validated in any of that and supported in any of that. And I didn't even know how to talk about the rape. It was just very, I think, dismissive. It was kind of like someone who can't take in that kind of information, to just immediate denial. And so I realized I'm not supported here. I'm not going to be protected. I'm not safe here. I thought that I could do things better on my own. I thought I could take care of myself better on my own. So at the age of 15, I ran away from home. And I literally ran into the arms of exploitation, one thing after another. I ended up meeting an a man. He was 24 at the time. And I moved in with him, and he was my boyfriend from the first day. I was just looking for love, looking for somewhere to belong, and he wanted me. I was in this relationship with him I think till the age of 18. He moved me into a drug house, and I didn't know what that was. But his sister was twice his age. She was married to a biker who had ties with the and he was trafficking drugs. I had no idea really what all that was till much later. So the are a very large organized biker gang. They're a known biker gang. It's all over the internet, you know. They're very organized and they're worldwide. But he had dealings with them, if not being one of them. He owed a bunch of money, and they were working, or whoever he owed the money to, because he was selling drugs, it needed to go back to Mexico. I remember the day that two of these guys came to recover the money. That was such a scary day. Oh my gosh. They didn't speak to me, but the woman of the house was so scared. She was so scared. And so the man of the house, he went out to collect the money. He's like, I'll be back. I got people that owe me money. I'll be back. I'll have your money. And so then she bargained with them, and she offered to trade me instead of giving them the money. And so they agreed. And I heard all of this, and I think I was so paralyzed with fear. I mean, I could have literally jumped out of the window and ran off, but I just curled up in a ball in my room and laid on the floor. And I remember I still had my Bible, even though at the time when I ran away from home, I ran away from God too. I was so angry with God. I blamed God for all of it because I'd prayed for so long. And then when my mom was almost killed by my stepdad, I had to leave my home. I had to leave the only church that I knew. And even though it wasn't a healthy church environment, it was still the only home I knew. It was the only place that I felt home because it represented God for me. And I was so close to God. I ran away from God, but I still kept my Bible. I knew it was powerful. Deep down, I really truly didn't want to be without God. Deep down, even though maybe I didn't realize it then, but deep down I was clinging in the only way that I could. And in that moment, curled up like a ball in that room, I just held my Bible. I held it in my arms. I held it close to my chest. And I couldn't even pray. I couldn't get words out, nothing. I was so scared. And then he came back. He had the money. And she begged him to keep the money and still trade me to these men. They had agreed. They were talking about how they were going to take me into Mexico. He thought about it, but he said, no, we need her here. She's the only one that takes care of her child. And they had a 2-year-old. And literally I was that 2-year-old's caregiver. They left, they took the money, they left, and then I still stayed there for another year. I was 17 at the time, till I was 18. And then my boyfriend at the time, he was working for a moving company. And so his boss saw a lot of the craziness that was happening at this house. His boss saw me as someone that really didn't belong. Not that any of those other individuals belong there either. But he saw something in me and he offered to help me. He gave me a job. And so I started working for him as an office assistant and then started booking moving appointments and ended up kind of running the office. Was there for about 3-4 years. But that first year that I was working there, I finally saw something outside of what I was experiencing. Because while I was there, fortunately, I didn't do any of those drugs that they were doing. It was offered a lot, but my boyfriend at the time, all he did was smoke weed. He didn't get along with them. He just had to live there. So we didn't do that. We just smoked weed and drank a little bit, and I took care of that little girl, and then I tried to get work, but ended up being labor trafficked 3 different times in that experience because I didn't know at 15 years old, being on my own, I didn't know what an ID was. I had been homeschooled. I didn't really go to regular school up until my very last year in school before running away from home. And so I didn't learn a whole lot. I knew nothing about how the world worked. All I knew was what I was taught at home in school and at church. That's it. I worked at one restaurant, just made tips only. I worked for a dog grooming business and I was washing dogs 8 hours a day and given $100 a week. And I would walk home soaking wet. I was sick all the time. And then I ended up working for a leather shop and I was sewing back covers for hand grips on baseball bats. I was sewing 500 a day in their back little room. They weren't giving me my fair wages because I didn't have the ID. Nobody told me how to do it. They just took advantage of the fact that I didn't have that. So that was my experience in labor trafficking up until the age of 18 when I had that job for the moving company. My boss, I don't know what was going through his head. I don't know what was happening with him, but he ended up building some storage in the warehouse above us, above the office. And I never went to see what it was. I just trusted him. He was a good guy. He was always good to me, never came on to me. He was kind of like a dad to me in a sense. And I remember taking over the office for the weekend because he was on a trip to Vegas with one of the moves. He would always do those moves because he loved to gamble. So when he came back on that Sunday, I had been there for about 4 years. I was 21. He was up in the warehouse. And so I go up there, you know, and I go to give him the paperwork for the weekend and tell him how everything was. And then I just see like massive weed plants and fans and blowers and this whole illegal grow system. And it was something out of a movie, you know, it was just so unreal to me. And then I saw the look on his face and I I realized that I didn't really know who he was. It scared me to death. So I just adapted, and so I just played it off. And so I just kind of laughed it off, and I was like, well, here's the papers. And that caused him to like break down laughing. And he just sat down and looked over the papers, and then he felt comfortable. And then I had a conversation with him, and I knew I couldn't stay there. I knew that this was illegal and this was wrong. I told him, I was like, I can't stay here. And you're gonna get busted. People that do this, they get busted all the time. And I left, and then I was couch surfing because I had nowhere to go. I had been staying at his place. He'd let me have a room at his place, and he ended up going to jail. He got caught a couple weeks later, and it was in the LA Times. He was busted with $450,000 worth of illegal marijuana. It's just one thing to another, you know, things falling apart, and then end up being vulnerable and just trying to survive, you know. I had a friend who told me about a position that was open, that she had another friend who knew of available position as a waitress, and it was at a strip club. No idea what a strip club was, you know. I'd never been to one. But I was 21 at the time, so I was old enough to work and serve drinks. And so I applied. They didn't get back to me, so I think I went back a week later, and I was like practically begging for the job because I hadn't found anything. They hired me, and then I was a waitress at a strip club. I remember looking at the girls as they danced around those poles, and how they maneuvered with the people and the things that they wore. And with the upbringing that I had, it was so opposite, because I grew up, we covered ourselves, we wore long dresses, we didn't even wear makeup, we weren't allowed to, and it just felt so icky to me. But then I ended up developing a love for these girls, you know. But in the beginning, I was so judgmental, and I would just look at them and be like, I would never do that, I could never do that. And then things got to a point to where I was going to lose that job. They had so many lawsuits from the city for people being drunk and leaving their facility, getting into accidents. They told us about a week before they were going to close the doors that they were closing. And at this time, as a waitress, I was making so much money there, partying. I was using cocaine. I was experimenting with drugs, you know, and primarily so I could keep drinking. Because I needed to drink. Drinking was the only way that I think I could numb everything I was feeling. I ended up getting a DUI through that process. That week that we were still open at that club, I took my money. I took all my tips the last day we were there, and I went upstairs to the girls' dressing room, and I bought a bunch of their outfits. And then I went to a club down the street, and I practiced a little bit at that little club because it was a little hole in the wall. And then I went to Long Beach and started dancing at a club in Long Beach. I had to leave the city or the county because I felt so embarrassed doing what I was doing. I knew that this wasn't for me. It just felt wrong. It felt off. And that first year as a dancer, watching all those eyes on me, not seeing me for who I really was inside, not seeing me for my potential, but just seeing me for what they could take from me. My worth was based on how I looked. My worth was based on what I could do for them. Halfway through that first year, I wanted to die. I was so spiritually and emotionally bankrupt by that time. I was drinking a lot. I had to drink to get on stage and perform. The security started keeping people from buying lap dances from me, so I wasn't making any money. I didn't notice that was happening. I just wasn't making any more money. And I had to pay the house. I had to pay the bartenders, the security. By the time I left, I had nothing. And so they would start arranging dates for me out of the club. And so that's my first experience being exploited, being sex trafficked out of the strip clubs. You can't have one without the other. When they talk about prostitution versus trafficking, sex trafficking, you can't have one without the other. Even in those legal industries, the legal venues, you're either trafficked into it or you're trafficked out of it. And all the stories I heard from all the girls, most of them didn't want to be there. Most of them had partners that were making them be there. There was this one girl who was there who never drank, never did any drugs. She looked so professional in how she was doing. I admired her. I looked up to her. I wanted to be her. And then I remember years after running into her at the mall. She was with her family, And she was married at the time she was working. This was a choice that they had all made. This was a choice that she had made for her life. But I just remember seeing her, and when our eyes met, when I saw her, she put her head down. She put her head down instantly. And I saw the shame and guilt on her. That told me that day that she wasn't even happy there. She wasn't even happy in that. So backtracking to my sexual exploitation through this industry, I ended up being held hostage for a couple weeks. I'm not going to go into all the details around it because it does involve highly organized crime and law enforcement in my experience. But I nearly lost my life in that experience. When I walked away from that experience in particular, that's what made me walk away from that industry completely. Well, I had already had an encounter where I nearly lost my life before, because I had started exploring and escorting while I was doing the dancing, because I wasn't making money at the club anymore. I remember the escort service was a business out of Las Vegas, parts of Las Vegas where prostitution is legal. And so it was a legitimate business due to that, but they were operating in California. The money went through the owners, passed down to my drivers who were the partners in this. I was only getting tips. So these guys were paying for me to come. I wouldn't see any of that money. I would only see money if they were happy with their experience and tipped. I had no knowledge of what money was going where. The driver was the one who paid me out. And half the time I never got paid out. They would tell me, they weren't satisfied or whatever. So that experience was another form of trafficking as well. I met an individual in that process. He was so high on cocaine. When I walked into his apartment, he was a buyer. He was a buyer. He was totally naked and just pacing around. He was like agitated, and he was needing some relief, and he made me so uncomfortable that I instantly refused. I wanted to leave. He kept me there. He would not let me leave. I remember telling him, I was like, my security's right outside, and he's like, no, he's not. No, he's not. This is a white neighborhood. He's not going to be standing out front my door. I can do whatever I want to you, and no one would care. I can kill you right now, and nobody's gonna come looking for you because you're just a prostitute. I blacked out. I don't remember all the details. I just remember finally walking out of that door. I can't even remember all the details around how I got back to my driver. I can't remember how many days passed before I got back up and did it again. And I remembered thinking every single time after that, like, I could really die. I could really lose my life doing this. Like, this is not safe. You don't know when that visit is going to be your last. You just don't. These people are especially cruel. That was my experience in that. But the other experience where I was kept hostage for 2 weeks, that definitely motivated me to walk away from it entirely. And so I did. And for a while, I had a boyfriend at the time. I had met him at the club, and I just ended up moving in with him. And he took care of me for a little bit. And then I ended up making my own business. I saw America's Dirtiest Jobs, and it was cleaning up after pets. It was pet waste removal. And it was really popular at the time, I guess, in the East Coast. And I just remember seeing that. I love pets, and I just remember thinking, well, all I need is a shovel and some trash bags, and how hard can that be? It was a really interesting experience. It was a good experience because I learned how to build my own website. I learned how to network. I started networking with other business networking groups, became a member of the chamber, and just started even getting myself to a point to where I was volunteering for political causes. And I was doing this for about a year, but I was working 7 days a week. I was driving around 5 different cities. I had done okay for myself, but I hadn't had any healing for any of the things that I'd experienced. I was still very vulnerable to exploitation. And I remember feeling very disappointed in my relationship at the time. He had lost his job. He'd been out of work for about a year at this point too. And so I went to a club with a friend. And then I met my last trafficker. was my daughter's father. And then I ended up being trafficked again in the form of labor trafficking. It was so crazy too how we met, how we connected. I was just seeking something. I was seeking love. I was seeking excitement, you know, and he filled all of that immediately right away. I never been wanted like this before, where someone wanted me 24/7 there with them all the time. And I saw that as love. I didn't see that as a form of control. I didn't see that as a form of isolation. He had me traveling all over with him for his business, and I thought he was a good person. He had a radio show about real estate, and he was helping people who were getting foreclosed on, but he was actually running a really huge con, and it was a national scam around foreclosure. And so I was doing the work of a paralegal. I was doing all these documents, and he initially promised to pay me for the work that I was doing. We even went to the bank, and he even signed up to have me on his payroll, and went through all the motions. And I remember, you know, watching all the people that were around him. They were working for him for free. And it was the weirdest thing to me. I was like, why are these people following him? You know, why are they working for free? Why, you know, it was just the weirdest thing. It didn't make any sense. And he treated them terribly too. Looking back now, you know, I realized that they were also being exploited. They were also being abused. But it looked different for me because I was his partner. I didn't experience all of that stuff in the first month. He treated me very, very different. He made me feel so special. He put me on a pedestal. He took me to Vegas to marry me. Like my biggest dream. I remember the first night I met, I told him all my dreams. He used that. He took me to Vegas to marry me. And it didn't happen. He ended up, I can't even remember what, but we ended up not doing that. He left one of the people that worked for him that he brought with us. He left her there without a car, without a way to get home. He just took off. He just grabbed me. We ended up not getting married. Something set him off. So grateful that we didn't get married. I started to see what kind of a monster this man was. I mean, he just left this poor girl in the hotel. And then he was driving around. My car was in a parking lot somewhere. It ended up being there for so long that they took it, they impounded it, and then it went to auction and sold, and he intentionally didn't take me back in time to get my car. Just one more thing, you know, after another to keep me completely dependent on him. I remember he made me put all my money into his account. I had no savings left. I lost my business. I lost everything. I started to see I was actually with a monster. We got into an argument so bad, I tried to jump out of the car, and he pulled over and he threatened to hurt my family if I left. And so I stayed. I stayed out of fear of what he would do to my family. And then I really, truly felt stuck. I was there with him for almost 2 years, and he had me in every Marriott hotel all the way across the states, all up and down California, running his scam, beating me, forcing me to use methamphetamine. I never wanted to use that drug in particular. I had dabbled in other things, you know, in my earlier years, but I was almost 30. I had my own business. I didn't want any of that, you know. I didn't even drink anymore, but he forced me to use that. And he would harass me constantly until I use. And then once I use, he would harass me for using it. The psychological abuse and manipulation and coercion was so exhausting. I really do feel like that experience is what gave me my PTSD. I remember teaching myself really how to meditate, how to lower my heart rate, because I hated being under the influence of that drug. And then I was pregnant. He actually forced a pregnancy on me. 6 months into my pregnancy, I think this is where I just finally reached my bottom. I finally reached a point to where I couldn't do it anymore. I was being forced to use drugs. I was being beat. I was being forced to do all these things. I couldn't barely sleep. I couldn't imagine having a child in this life. I couldn't imagine bringing a child into this. But then I also I come from a faith where you don't abort your baby. I couldn't do that either. I didn't even have a means to, really, if I had even tried. I never got to see doctors, dentists. So my only way out at that point, I felt, was to take my life. And so at 6 months pregnant, I tried to take my life. I remember being in the bathtub with the razor, and I remember cutting into my wrists, both of my wrists. And then I remember him coming inside and seeing me like that, and he just laughed at me. And he wrapped up my arm, he wrapped up my wrist. The cuts weren't super deep. I remembered walking around in public with him with both of my wrists wrapped up, like, you know what that is, you know. And nobody said anything, nobody did anything, nobody noticed. I just felt so invisible and so helpless. But back to that point in the bathtub, after he left and walked out, I remember just sitting there. And this was 17 years later since I had walked away from God, since I had run away from home. 6 months pregnant, I called out to God for the first time in 17 years. And I said, God, if you're really there, if you're real, I said, protect my baby. If you give me a healthy baby, a baby that's free from the harms of the drugs and all the things happening in my body, I said, if you give me a healthy girl, I said, I'll give her to you. And she was born a week overdue. She was born a week overdue. I think I had my first doctor visit during the pregnancy when she was literally a month due. And I remember going in and seeing the doctor, and the doctor was like, where's your medical file? And I just like made something up because he was right there. The doctor was really kind of disturbed that I didn't have any medical history in any system that he could find. And I just said, well, we're coming from another area. I remember when I was giving birth, I remember when the doctors pulled her from me. I just remember seeing this arm up in the air. She had grabbed the scissors that they were going to use to cut the cord. She grabbed the scissors as they were pulling her out, and she was like, holding these scissors up. She just came out this like fierce little fighter, you know? And the doctors looked her over, they tested her, they did all these things. She was fine. There was nothing wrong with her. She was a healthy girl. Despite everything, she was a healthy baby girl, healthy weight. And they put her on my chest. And when I looked into her eyes for the first time, I finally realized what love was on a human level. And I realized at that moment that God was real and that God had heard my prayer. He answered my prayer. He gave me a healthy girl. I was in the hospital with her for 3 days. I promised her. He had gone out to the car or something, and I just promised her, I said, I'll never let anyone hurt you. I kept her so close to me. I never let him hold her. He didn't even really care to hold her either, so it was easy for me to keep him away. He stopped feeding me drugs for 3 months so I could breastfeed her. And then after 3 months, he put me back on the drugs. I had picked up a case, a possession case in this process before she was born. I was pregnant. He had stolen a car. He drove around in circles knowing the car had been reported stolen because the rental company called him. So he drove around in circles until he got pulled over, and he gave me the drugs to hold. And I remember, this is weird because he never does that. He's always in control of that. I just thought it was weird. But then we got pulled over. I told the police, I told them it wasn't mine, but possession is 9/10 of the law. It was in my purse. So I got arrested, and I remember having a chain with handcuffs around my waist, around my pregnant belly. I picked up a possession charge. I had the first court appearance to show what I had been doing, that I'd been doing the drug court classes and all of that, and I hadn't gotten anything done. He wouldn't let me do anything. And then he drugged me that night before the court. So I was up all night because I couldn't sleep because of the drugs. And then I went into court trying everything I could to not look like I was high. As I was walking into court, I actually had a moment inside me where I wanted to ask for help. I wanted to say what was happening. And then the judge looked up at me after he had called my name, and I had walked up. The judge looked at me after he was read my file, and then he just looked at me with so much disgust. And I knew I wasn't safe there. I knew I wasn't going to be heard. And so I just went about and did what I needed to do. I did everything I could. A month after she was born, somehow I was able to convince him to take me to a church, to have her dedicated, because I wouldn't stop asking for that. I just knew I had to do that. I knew I had to do that because I made a promise to God to give her back to him. But he chose the church. So we went there, and then he was standing there with me, all, faking the whole thing and acting like a proud father. But that, I didn't care. I was there for me. I was there for her. I was there for my promise. I have been trying to make good on that promise ever since. Finally, she's 11 months old now. I'm still stuck in this situation. At this point, she's finally reacting to the abuse that she's watching happen. Because when he would hit me, she would just laugh. It was funny to her. But this one day, I remember the door was open, the front door was open, but he was over top of me, and I was laid out on the ground. I was screaming for help, and she was standing right next to me. And she had these little curls, and she's had tears running down her cheeks. I remember that. And she was screaming, "Mommy, mommy, mommy." All I could see was her. All I could see was her. All I could think about was her in that moment. It made me think about all the times I was crying for help from my mom when she was experiencing domestic violence. That all just kind of flashed before my eyes, that whole history. And then I realized that I was hurting her. I was the one hurting her by allowing this to continue. So it snapped my mama bear into action. It motivated me in an effort to protect her because I couldn't keep her in this. It took me about 3 days to get away. Every time he'd go in the bathroom, I'd gather stuff. I'd gather some of her things, some of my things, and I put them in a bag and I hid it behind a bush outside of the house. On the 3rd day, he left the keys on the table when he went to the bathroom, and I grabbed her, I grabbed the keys, I grabbed the bag that was outside, and I just ran to the car. I buckled her in. I got in the car. By the time I was shutting my door, he was running out of the house, backing down the driveway, and I'm paralyzed with fear, but I'm still going. He couldn't stop me, and I just peeled out and then drove down the hill, and the windows were down. As I'm driving off, I remember the wind like resuscitating my lungs, kind of like a defibrillator to the heart. I felt like I could breathe again. I looked back in the rearview mirror. I looked back at her, and I just said, "Mom is home." When I told her Mom is home, what that insinuated for me, I think in that moment, was that I was finally present. I wasn't allowing these things. I was protecting her. I wasn't going anywhere, and I wasn't leaving. I had him arrested for possession of domestic violence because I still didn't know what trafficking was or what exploitation looked like. I had no idea. The Child Welfare Service at the time, CFWB now, they were so good to me. They encouraged me to get a restraining order. I got a restraining order the next day. He got out the next day, ended up connecting with me still, wanting to get together with me to do drugs. I had him arrested. I had told him to come to a hotel that was close to where I was, and then I would meet him there. And then I called law enforcement and had him arrested for possession. And then he had a warrant for his arrest out of the state of Colorado. I think that it was the Attorney General who was going after him for grand theft and impersonating an attorney. And so I sent him over there, and then he ended up going to prison for that. I answered questions with their office, with the Attorney General's office, and helped how I could. But even still, at the time, that was happening. I didn't have the knowledge that I had been labor trafficked. I didn't have any understanding. And so I think there would have been possibly more charges. Never got justice for that specific thing with him. I did receive a restraining order for life that protects me and my daughter. After he was gone, within that first year, that was my first year of healing, I was staying with my grandparents. And I started going to my grandmother's church on Thursdays, not on Sundays, but I started going back to church because I knew the only way I was going to change me to better myself for her was to get back into my faith. So that was my first plan. The only plan I knew really was to get back into spiritual health. I remember going to this women's Bible study every single Thursday for a whole entire year. I barely said a word. I just listened to everything they had to say. I was going through a study on the book of Mark. The study was called The Call to Follow Jesus, written by Kim Laliberte. I remember 2 weeks into that study, I got the call to do something with everything that had happened to me. I actually wrote it down in my book. Do something with my past, you know? That's when I got the call, and I hesitated a little bit to move into action yet, but I remember it weighed heavy on me. It was just constant on my mind. And through that study, I started to really experience who I was in God. I started to finally see myself in God's eyes. We were talking about gifts for God, gifts that we can offer God, right? And I remember the teacher asking, what is your most extravagant gift ever given to God? And at first I was just sitting there thinking to myself, nothing. Like, I don't have anything. I was poor. I had no job. I had nothing to offer. It hit me because I had seen how God sees me. And I realized I am that extravagant gift. And I stood up and I said, I am that extravagant gift. And everyone was quiet. And then everyone started clapping as that reality sank in for them too. That was really the turning point for me in my spiritual walk. And then I found a church that I could feel like home in. And they announced a justice conference on the topic of human trafficking. And it was so interesting to me. So I went. When I walked into the doors of that church, I instantly felt the presence of the Holy Spirit. Not that he wasn't at the other churches. Those churches just weren't for me at that point. I was meant to be there. And so I went to that conference. I felt so at home. And I realized after hearing another survivor share her trafficking experience, I realized that I finally had a name for what I'd experienced. But I also realized that, she's telling her story. I can do that. I can tell my story. And so I connected with her, got connected with Runaway Girl Incorporated, started working with them, started learning a lot about my own exploitation through them, became educated in how to educate law enforcement in response and protocol with CSEC, with trafficking and CSEC. Connected with Sower's education group, got connected with the survivor leader group in San Diego as they were just forming, became a founding member with them, with that organization. And I just put myself anywhere I could to share my experience and educate the community. That all started in August of 2014, the same month I went back to school, because up until that point, still hadn't had any avenue for me to do the work, you know? I was just kind of waiting around, and I was like, well, God, you called me to this, but what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? I got connected to different people, LA, but everything kept leading back to San Diego. The same month I started school, because I started studying psychology, and that's where I started to really remember the dreams that I had had when I was younger, learning about human behavior, and that's what I was learning, and that's what I started to really focus on. And it's been so helpful in my ability to be able to counsel others. From there, while I was in my studies, then I started running a peer support group for a program called Alabaster Jar Project, which was in the process of sheltering adult women survivors of exploitation. That's kind of where my counseling role kind of started in all of that. Still continuing to do advocacy. I think the same year, 2015, is when I started getting involved in legislation. Because in 2015, Amnesty International, US and UK came together to vote to recommend full decriminalization of sex work policy around the world. And so several of us came together and fought that. We requested that they didn't do that. We tried to educate them on what sex work was and the harms of it, the inherent harms in it, in that lifestyle. It's full of exploitation. In my experience with even legal venues of sex work, in any system of prostitution, it is inherently harmful. You've heard a little bit of my experiences in it, my near-death experiences, my exploitation, being pulled into sex trafficking. Out of that, you don't know when that day is going to be your last. You just don't know who you're going to meet, how they're going to hurt you. You just don't know. It is so unsafe physically, but it's also detrimental to your spirit, to your emotional, and to your mental health. One of the things I would do is I would tell myself that I chose this for myself. I would tell myself that this was empowering. I would twist it in a way to where I was like, well, you know, all I knew before was with sex, it was taken from me. Now I have some power and control because I get to say who, what, when, where, and how much. But in reality, I wasn't in control. I was still being exploited throughout the whole process. It was just something I had to tell myself to be okay. But it was so dangerous. And like I said, I nearly lost my life. And so that's something that just kind of fuels me in this. And really, I want to change the narrative. It's not okay to allow men to buy vulnerable people. It's not okay for men to buy children for sex. It's not okay for men to use these vulnerable people for their own pleasure. Once money changes hands, it's like you're their property. They own you. They can do whatever they want to. That's the way it feels. And you push back, you fight back, and you're strangled, or you're stabbed, or you're robbed, or you're shoved out of a moving vehicle naked, or you're dropped off in cities with no way of getting home. Sweden's doing great things legally, by the way, in this, and since the 90s, they really are leading the efforts to combat this and educate men on how to treat women and girls. And I'm part of a survivor coalition that works really hard to get these same measures done here and just open people's eyes. And so most recently, there's 12 states now in the US, including our state, right now as we speak, that are going through the process of increasing penalties on buyers and holding the demand accountable. It's very easy to recognize, if you think about it, there would be no need for supply if there was no demand. So we need more men to stand up and protect women and speak out against these things, hold each other accountable. We need to curb the demand. So right now, in process here in this state is AB 379. It was helped develop by survivors. Assemblymember Maggie Kraut authored the bill. We are currently in the last stages of its process. It's holding hotels accountable, it's holding businesses accountable, and it's holding the demand accountable. It's the first of its kind in our state. And so it's making its way through the process. And I remember the first day praying with another survivor at the Capitol on that steel and believing in faith, because this is all part of his call on my life. And so I go. And so we prayed together in agreement over that, this whole process. And so I knew in my heart that it was already won. It's a done deal. The battle's won on this end. We have a lot of opposition, but they're failing because he is still sovereign. He is still in control. He is still in charge, and he has called us to this, and he equips us in it.